David. Welcome to the show. The Assembly looks like they extended their session to June 17th, and the Senate wraps up on June 12th. Let's talk about some of these current time pressures and how does it shape the urgency on the remaining agenda in Albany as of right now.
This year, the end of session has been reduced in length because the state budget went much later than usual. This fiscal year is supposed to end March 31st, and we expect that the budget is always going to be a little later than that, but this year the budget wasn't done until early May, and that really ate into the time that state lawmakers would have to pass their bills. The budget is more like the governor's plaything, and the end of session is their time to shine. And with the budget cutting into that, they've had to really respond to this time crunch. And in the assembly, as you mentioned, they're going to go into overtime. They've already said we're going to stay at least 3 extra days. The Senate, where they're able to move things a little faster, have made no such changes, and they're going to have some lengthy nights this week as they try to move both some major bills as well as those maybe more boring but everyday types of bills that need to get done, like tax extenders, for example, that are set to expire this year and local governments are counting on.
Let's go over some of the bills that sort of stand out to you that they're going to be working on in these last remaining days.
So the most high profile issue is what's billed as the Medical Aid in Dying Act. This is legislation that would allow terminally ill New Yorkers to end their lives with the help of a physician, something that's been debated in Albany for years now, but never came back for a floor vote until this past spring when it got a vote in the Assembly. It wasn't clear whether it was going to ever come up in the Senate, but as we're recording early Monday morning, it appears that the vote is going to happen in the Senate this afternoon and into the early evening. And what remains to be seen is whether Governor Kathy Hochul will actually sign this bill or whether all of this maneuvering and political sacrificing, because this is a controversial issue, will be for naught. Ultimately, though, this has the potential to be the one big issue that does get done here in Albany, because while there are issues that progressive Democrats would like to see addressed, such as prison reform, some environmental bills, I'm skeptical whether any of them get across the finish line at this point.
Yeah, definitely crunch time. And let's talk about sort of the federal cuts that would affect the budget. The budget includes triggers for like a federal cuts over 2 billion. How likely is Albany to sort of reconvene mid-year if those cuts actually materialize?
As you said, state lawmakers approved a budget worth more than $250 billion, and it includes some language designed to respond to the likelihood that the money we're banking on from the federal government may not come in the amounts that we're expecting. Because this budget did not make any hard choices. This budget did not proactively respond to the likelihood of cuts by either reducing spending or raising state revenues. And what remains to be seen is how the state government ends up responding, because theoretically, the state legislature could say, yes, we want to be active partners in responding to whatever cuts that come from Washington, D.C. But my feeling is that the state lawmakers will not necessarily want to own budget cuts because budget cuts are not popular. And this is one of those times where the governor is likely going to have to be the adult in the room, so to speak, and they'll be the one who is going to lead on these cuts. And that's something we saw in the wake of the Great Recession with then Governor David Patterson taking the lead on the reduction of spending, and he was not very popular as the result of that. So I'm very curious to see how the legislature and governor take on these different roles in the fall with what's expected to be some challenging fiscal times.
Now, let's take a look what's in our area. The Assembly 100 District Paula K. Her office, and she's been saying online that the office cites strong wins in affordability and safety and the 2025-26 budget. But what's actually heading to her district? And what remains pending for her district?
So, in terms of legislation for Assemblymember Paula Kay, who is a freshman Democrat, I think we need to set our sights realistically low because as a freshman member, she has much less sway than, say, her predecessor, Aileen Gunther, who was here for, I think, about 2 decades at the time of her retirement. So she has a bunch of sort of local interest bills, some in which she carries with Republican State Senator Pete Oberacker, whose district overlaps with her. And so far, I think that's probably what she's going to be able to get across the finish line. There's some bills that she carries dealing with private school transportation in Sullivan County. There's a bill dealing with the selling of controlled substances and whether that's bail eligible. Those are two bills that she carries with Senator Oberacker. I am skeptical either of those is going to get across the finish line at this point. What you're going to want to watch out for is her sway in securing some pork spending, if you
Mm.
will. Everyone says member items are dead here in Albany, and that's money that members can steer home to their districts. But that's not quite the case. Much like Frankenstein, they've been resurrected in new forms in terms of what's called bullet aid and other types of appropriations. And in the final days of the legislative session here in Albany, the Assembly will vote on a bunch of resolutions that will include different pots of money that Paula Kaye might be able to steer to the hundredth assembly district. So that's something to watch in terms of where she's going to steer some of these resources.
Now let's talk about you mentioned Oberacker. Let's look at Senator Oberacker's 51st state senate district. So, what local priorities like that he's looking at, like infrastructure and rural healthcare, are sort of still unresolved?
Well, if Assemblymember Paula Kaye has little influence in the assembly, Senator Oberacker has even less influence in the state senate. So he may have dreams of taking on some of the big issues you're talking about, like affordability and some of these more ideological concerns. But at the end of the day, I think he's going to be focused on getting some of those tax extenders and tax creation bills across the finish line. And for example, there's one maybe a little bit outside of your neck of the woods dealing with the city of Oneonta and the authorization of an occupancy tax. There's also one that he does with Paula Kaye dealing with the village of Bloomingburg and their efforts to basically handle some delinquent properties and taking over a role from the county. But yeah, I wouldn't expect him to be grabbing too many headlines between now and the end of the legislative session, given that he is a Republican in a body ruled by Democrats.
Let's just take a look at the future here. Antonio Delgado has launched a challenge to Governor Kathy Hochul. In his campaign, he's talking about things like universal health care. How might his run for governor sort of reshape legislative alliances or sort of policy in the upcoming year?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up something like universal health care. So, a gubernatorial challenge has the potential to shift the agenda of what the incumbent is focusing on. And I think about 2018, and in that year, then incumbent Andrew Cuomo was facing a primary to his far left from Cynthia Nixon. And I think she influenced some of the agenda that he focused on in 2018. He began to approach marijuana in a different light. And I think that there's the potential for Antonio Delgado, if his campaign gains any sort of traction over the next year, because the primary is not till June of 2026, if he gains traction, maybe Governor Hochul will respond on some of the issues that he's focusing on. And I think he's going to run a campaign that is supposed to be, say, the working person's agenda. And this governor has focused a lot on affordability, but maybe she tailors that message to lower income New Yorkers as opposed to a more broader affordability agenda. But all of that is based on the idea that Antonio Delgado's campaign actually takes off in a meaningful way. If he is just a gnat nipping at her heels, so to speak, then she doesn't have to respond to him. She can go ahead and continue with her agenda as she sees fit. But if he's able to gain traction, if he's able to steer the agenda, if he's able to steer the media narrative, then sure, I think Governor Hochul is going to have to be responsive, but he has a long way to go, many mountains to climb before he's a part of a serious conversation with regards to the gubernatorial election in 2026. Right now, if I'm Governor Kathy Hochul, I'm more concerned with who my potential Republican opponent will be in a general election.
Wrapping up here, well, beyond policy, what do you see gaining momentum as sort of the session winds down? What sort of everyone sort of is on the agenda for everybody going into this wind down?
Most people's agenda is actually focused farther away than Albany, and it's eyeing New York City. There are a lot of people that have a vested interest and maybe just a purient interest in what's happening with the Democratic primary to be the New York City mayoral nominee, in which former Governor Andrew Cuomo is mounting his political comeback, and right now he's in great position. And I think that is influencing kind of the appetite that Democrats here in the state legislature have to take on a variety of challenges. And I think they are more focused back home for a lot of these members on New York City. So there are some major issues still at play here, like updating the state's temporary disability insurance program, something that's been locked in place with a benefit of $170 a week for more than 3 decades. That was something that almost got done last year, and I think that's one of the issues on the table for this year that's still at play. There's also an effort to reduce single use plastic packaging with a very broad, comprehensive bill championed by State Senator Pete Harckham and Assemblymember Deborah Glick. And whether that has the ability to move through the assembly kind of speaks to the bandwidth in that chamber. As, like I said, people are sort of focused on other things, and bringing it back to the beginning, there's only so many days left and so many bills, so many hundreds of bills that they need to get done as a matter of course, that it remains to be seen whether they'll be able to take on some of those bills and issues that are not necessarily a requirement to end the session, such as addressing the temporary disability insurance, such as updating maybe some of the environmental and energy laws, or addressing single-use plastic packaging waste.
It definitely will be interesting to see that interaction if former Governor Cuomo becomes mayor of New York City and has to deal
I'm
with
I'm licking my
budget.
chops. I'm licking my chops for when he has to return to Albany for Tin Cup Day and make
Mm,
the case for his budget and ask lawmakers for money. Some of them who called for his ouster 4 years ago.
yeah, definitely will be interesting. David, before we go, is there anything else that we have not touched on you want our listeners to know about some of these the ending days of the what's happening in Albany?
I think one thing we should be cognizant of is the fact that 6 months ago, there was a major conversation about prison reform in New
Mm.
York following the death of Robert Brooks at a central New York prison. That conversation has died down to like a whimper. There's efforts by progressives in the legislature and in the criminal justice space to bring it back to life, to give it a stay of execution before the end of the session, so to speak. But it really seems unlikely that there's going to be anything substantive done in that area, short of the governor giving some money for cameras in prisons and authorizing a lower age for prison guards to start, which is something I would not necessarily have predicted 6 months ago, when there seemed to be a lot of momentum for at least something substantive to get done in this space. So it's one of those issues that was a real swing at and a miss for state policymakers.
Well, we're talking to Dave Lombardo, talking about the last days in Albany for lawmakers. Thank you so much for joining me on the program.
It's my pleasure.